1. They were walking home from school that warm spring day. Every day they walked the same route, so much so that they had embedded a trail into the ground. Beth was the older sister. She was in charge of Emma on their daily walks to school. Their mother had trusted Beth, being the older sister, would protect Emma. Emma was quite adventurous, you would say. The river was flowing faster than usual as the mountain snow was melting. Something shiny caught Emma's eye, and she quickly ran to the shore to take a look. She knew she wasn't allowed to go near the water, but she did anyway. In the blink of an eye, she reached down to grab the shiny object and fell in. Beth screamed a scream that Emma had never heard before, and she knew she was in trouble. Without hesitation, Beth jumped in to save Emma. Unfortunately, the river won that day, and the girls were found 3 days later. I was driving up north to Lucerne, California, to visit my brother, as it was my nephew's second birthday. We were going to stay the weekend. I was so excited to see Reef, as I didn't get to do so on his first birthday. I remember the odd feeling I got when we first arrived. I instantly pictured an older man walking down the hallway. I shook it off as being nothing, as I sometimes get visions. The first night we slept on the living room floor. It was quite late when something woke me up. I can only describe it as a buzzing feeling. I tried to go back to sleep, but it woke me up again. This time, it was accompanied by giggling. There were 2 of them. I could tell by their voices. They were running back and forth from the living room to the kitchen. 2 little girls running back and forth giggling. I didn't know if it was real or if I was dreaming. I reached out my arm to touch my husband's arm so he could wake me up, as I often do when I am in this state of mind. I don't know if I'm in a trance or if this really is the way I connect with spirits. The next morning I told my brother that I slept terribly. He and his wife looked at each other and chuckled. My mom overheard the conversation, and she didn't sleep well either. I told them what happened last night, and my mom jumped in to say that someone had been pulling on her blanket all night. She'd pull it up, and something would pull it right back down. My sister-in-law chimed in to tell us that the house was haunted. One morning, Reef was playing outside. I think my brother and his wife were just moving into the house. Reef was a little over a year old. He seemed to be talking to someone. He motioned for someone to come sit by him and scooted over. He was having a conversation, but nobody was there. My brother Dustin was moving the refrigerator into the kitchen. He was putting it into position when it scooted forward towards him on its own, almost smashing his finger. The ground was flat, and there was no explanation for it. Another time, Crystal looked up at the baby monitor in Reef's bedroom for whatever reason, and she could literally see the form of a little girl. The girl had climbed up the side of Reef's crib and was poking him. On another occasion, Crystal walked into Reef's room. There was a built-in dresser, as there usually are built-ins in older homes. The drawers were pulled out as if someone was using them as stairs. Each drawer pulled out had a little bit more than the other. I also do believe Crystal told me that she had seen a man as well. As soon as I got home, I started Googling deaths in the area. It took some digging, but I was able to find an article about 2 sisters drowning in a nearby river. I was shook. This verified that everything we had experienced was indeed the sisters. The house no longer stands, as it was burnt down in a fire. But I wonder if the little girls are still there. And who was that man? 2. I don't know what to do with what I saw last night, and I can't stop thinking about it. I've looked up everything I can think of, and nothing has matched what I saw. So I thought maybe it was something paranormal of nature, and wanted to see if anyone here might be able to know. Last night, me and 2 of my friends went to a cemetery that was next to our campus. We are college students. We thought it would be fun to go around and look at all the graves and find the oldest one there. This cemetery is off of a main road that runs through the campus, but it goes back very far, so much so that if you were on the other side of the cemetery, you would not be able to see the road for the lights coming from the street. So we were pretty far back when this happened. The only light was coming from our phone flashlights. The moon and the little solar light things that people put on graves, you know? And there were a few main paths that run throughout the cemetery, separating sides and allowing for a walking path. So my friends were on one side, and I walked across the path to see what was on the other side. I was almost across the path when I heard a rustling sound coming from my right, around the 2 o'clock direction for me, if you were standing where I was. And I look and see this smaller white thing kinda curled up next to the trunk of this tree. My first thought was, oh, it's a rabbit, and I looked away. But as soon as I looked away, I realized that it didn't have fur, or a tail, or any ears I could see. So it almost looked sleek. I looked back at it and it moved. Now it was standing on all fours with his back arched. Kind of like how a cat arches his back. Its legs, I guess you would call them, looked almost like human forearms. That's the best way I can describe it. Like when you put your arms completely straight, and your elbow isn't really visible, and it's just thin and long. I couldn't see his head. All I could make out was this thin, pale, pasty-looking thing that was completely still. Once I clocked what I was looking at, I immediately felt a wave of heat come over me, like getting the chills or goosebumps, but instead of cold, I felt so insanely hot. Not sweating, but like even my insides felt warm. My brain immediately told me to turn and run back, so that's what I did. I ran back across the path and 10-ish yards, maybe, back to my friends. They asked me what was wrong, and all I could say was that I saw something. One of my friends asked where, so he could go and see if he saw it too, and my other friend followed him. I trailed behind them a few feet, but I kept my distance. I wasn't going anywhere back to that thing. Now, the one friend that asked where didn't see it, but my other friend did. She said she saw a white furthest thing, and it looked like it was hiding its head or face behind this tree. Now, importantly, I didn't tell them what I saw. So her describing that she saw the same thing freaked me out. This time, though, she said it wasn't as arched and seemed to be standing more flat. She said she felt so insanely cold and got chills all over her body, the opposite reaction I had. But she ran back too. Our friend was mad he didn't see it, and didn't seem super nervous or concerned. But I know what I saw, and I have another person to agree with me. I don't know what it was, and I can't imagine of this thing out of my head. I hadn't had a feeling of life or death like that in so long. Do any of you have answers to this? Paranormal or not, I just can't stop thinking about it. 3. I've been in this apartment for a few years now. I live with my mom, my cat, and my aunt and her cat used to live with us, until moving out just recently. My aunt would spend most of her time in her room. She has anxiety. And her cat never left her room because our cat hates other cats. The first thing I experienced here were my blankets moving in the night. When this first happened, I had the comforter down at the end of my bed because I was hot. I woke up in the morning to find the blanket covering me. Now, I know people will say that I moved this in my sleep, or you might assume that my mom or aunt might have done something. Well, I asked my mom and aunt, despite this not being something my aunt would ever do. And both said they hadn't. I'm usually a heavy sleeper, unless someone comes into my room, so I would have woken up if one of them had come in. Plus, they had no reason to lie about doing it. As for moving it in my sleep, it's not something I've ever done before, and I don't sleepwalk or anything. This is more obviously not me doing something in my sleep when it happened again more recently. I was cold and sleeping with the comforter on, and when I woke up the next morning, the blanket was folded neatly at the end of my bed. Key here, neatly. Yes, I have kicked my blanket off me in my sleep, or woken up half asleep, and shoved it off before. But always it ends up in a heap or haphazardly pushed around and off me. But the blanket was folded purposefully. This happened a few times. It gave me the feeling of a passed-on relative making sure I'm not freezing or overheating in the night, so I'm not particularly worried about this strangeness. Sometime last year, I had this other strange experience. I wear contacts, and when I take off my glasses in the morning to put them in, I set my glasses on a bookcase in the living room. This bookcase is against the wall shared with the craft room, which is sometimes also the cat's litter box room. At this point, we had a neon orange, super bouncy ball that my cat loves to chase set upon the bookcase. My glasses and a few other knickknacks kept this ball from rolling off onto the floor. Now, I had gone to the bathroom and was returning to the living room when I saw the neon orange ball bounce out from the craft room. As I said, the ball had been on the bookshelf in the living room. My mom, who was in her room, had not moved it, and my cat was curled up in her bed, also in the living room, and my aunt wasn't home. The ball very much came from the craft room, where it had not been when I left the living room earlier. It also bounced, not falling from something, and kind of slightly bounced, but it was like someone had actually bounced it, making it go high in the air before hitting the carpet and rolling slightly to a stop. I have no explanation for this. I very much saw the ball on the bookcase in the living room as I set my glasses down, and I very clearly saw it come in from the craft room after. A few months after that, well, I'm not sure if it's paranormal or just cat weirdness or a glitch in the Matrix type of thing, but I'm putting it with all this. So I was in my living room, and my cat got up and came over to me to convince me to get up because it was lunchtime. She likes eating and drinking while I make my lunch. So I got up and she raced ahead of me to the kitchen, as she usually does. I was right behind her. When I entered the kitchen, she wasn't there. This baffled me, so I checked the pantry and the bathroom, and she wasn't there either. I turned back around and called for her, because occasionally she'll come out when I do. As I walked into the living room, my cat came trotting out from my mom's room. Now, the kitchen and my mom's room are on completely opposite sides of the apartment, meaning she would have had to get by me to go from the kitchen to her room. I had been right behind her when she ran into the kitchen, and I didn't see her leave and run past me. There is absolutely no way I would not have seen her. I don't know how she got from one end of the building to the other, but it was very odd. Now, two things happened just a couple of days ago. The first thing was that one of my contacts went missing. I take out my contacts every night at the kitchen counter. Bathroom sink is too small with little to no counter space, because I don't want my contacts to fall into the sink or down the drain. I always very deliberately make sure my contacts are in the case before closing them up and putting them away. My left contact had gone missing a couple of times before, and while annoyed, I did assume I was misplacing it somehow, but having it twice before, I was now paranoid about it happening again, and made absolutely sure both contacts were in the solution before closing it up and putting them away. The next morning, the contact was gone. It wasn't stuck to the cap, it wasn't pressed against the sides of the case. I did eventually find it dried up under one of the things on the kitchen counter, which sure seems like I misplaced it, but there was no way this could have happened because it was very much in the case. I could see the slight blue tint of it in the solution before I put the cap on. This one may have some explanation, but I'm not able to find it myself, because I have no idea how it could have gotten out of the case in the middle of the night on its own. The second thing happened the next day. I was taking my morning shower, and my mom had left to go visit my grandma, as she usually does on the weekends. I was alone in the house aside from my cat. As I was washing up, I heard the front door open and close, and footsteps. After a moment, I heard my mom's voice, annoyed, and having what sounded like a conversation on the phone. I couldn't make out words, but it was definitely her voice. I was wondering if something had happened, but she wasn't trying to shout to me over the sound of the water, so I figured it wasn't anything too serious. But was confused as to her being back home so quickly, as she usually doesn't come back until around 2 or 3. This was 11 or 12-ish. Then I heard her say her cat's name, and so I thought she was scolding her for something, but I had no idea what for. There were pauses of silence here and there before the conversation would pick back up, and there'd be the occasional footsteps, sounding like she was walking around the kitchen and living room. And then eventually it stopped as I got out of the shower. I left the bathroom completely expecting to see my mom and ask her what was going on, but she wasn't there. The front door was still locked, and I hadn't heard her leave. I did hear one of the neighbors in this apartment building talking with her son outside, but she sounds nothing like my mom. Her voice is higher pitched than my mom's. Most of our neighbors are guys, with only one other woman, and she wasn't nearby, and she also doesn't sound like my mom. When my mom did actually come home, I asked her if she had come back at some point, and she hadn't. She doesn't know what happened either. So yeah, these are the weird experiences I've been having in this apartment. I don't know what to make of them. I have to assume that if these things are all paranormal, then there's multiple spirits or entities. Because while the blanket thing doesn't feel bad at all, the bouncy ball and the missing contact feel playful and mischievous. But the last thing with my mom's voice very much freaked me out. That could be because I've heard mimics and that they can be dangerous, as opposed to whatever actually being negative. But I don't know. I haven't really experienced much in the way of paranormal before, personally, even though I do believe. My mom, however, has always been sensitive to it. I know when she was a teen and my aunt, the one that lived with us, and some friends played with a Ouija board, and they experienced activity while doing so. And my mom had told me, after we moved out, that in the house we lived when I was between 3 and 8, she would hear a baby crying under the stairs at night. She knew it wasn't me, because she'd go check on me, I'd be asleep and fine, and as I grew older, the crying remained that of a baby. That same house, right before we moved out, I did get very creepy vibes and refused to be there alone, despite having no particular reason why. That's about the closest to a paranormal experience I've had before all this. Anyway, like I said, I don't know what to make of what's been happening. I haven't been able to properly debunk anything, which is why I'm leaning towards it being paranormal in some way. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this, though. What do you think is happening? Could there be a mimic, or something else, fae? Or can you think of something non-paranormal for these that I haven't? 3. I've been in this apartment for a few years now. I live with my mom, my cat, and my aunt and her cat used to live with us, until moving out just recently. My aunt would spend most of her time in her room. She has anxiety, and her cat never left her room because our cat hates other cats. The first thing I experienced here were my blankets moving in the night. When this first happened, I had the comforter down at the end of my bed because I was hot. I woke up in the morning to find the blanket covering me. Now, I know people will say that I moved this in my sleep, or you might assume that my mom or aunt might have done something. Well, I asked my mom and aunt, despite this not being something my aunt would ever do, and both said they hadn't. I'm usually a heavy sleeper, unless someone comes into my room, so I would have woken up if one of them had come in. Plus, they had no reason to lie about doing it. As for moving it in my sleep, it's not something I've ever done before, and I don't sleepwalk or anything. This is more obviously not me doing something in my sleep when it happened again more recently. I was cold and sleeping with the comforter on, and when I woke up the next morning, the blanket was folded neatly at the end of my bed. Key here, neatly. Yes, I have kicked my blanket off me in my sleep, or woken up half asleep, and shoved it off before, but always it ends up in a heap or haphazardly pushed around and off me. But the blanket was folded purposefully. This happened a few times. It gave me the feeling of a passed-on relative making sure I'm not freezing or overheating in the night, so I'm not particularly worried about this strangeness. Sometime last year, I had this other strange experience. I wear contacts, and when I take off my glasses in the morning to put them in, I set my glasses on a bookcase in the living room. This bookcase is against the wall shared with the craft room, which is sometimes also the cat's litter box room. At this point, we had a neon orange, super bouncy ball that my cat loves to chase set upon the bookcase. My glasses and a few other knickknacks kept this ball from rolling off onto the floor. Now I had gone to the bathroom and was returning to the living room when I saw the neon orange ball bounce out from the craft room. As I said, the ball had been on the bookshelf in the living room. My mom, who was in her room, had not moved it, and my cat was curled up in her bed, also in the living room, and my aunt wasn't home. The ball very much came from the craft room, where it had not been when I left the living room earlier. It also bounced, not falling from something, and kind of slightly bounced, but it was like someone had actually bounced it, making it go high in the air before hitting the carpet and rolling slightly to a stop. I have no explanation for this. I very much saw the ball on the bookcase in the living room as I set my glasses down, and I very clearly saw it come in from the craft room after. A few months after that, well, I'm not sure if it's paranormal or just cat weirdness or a glitch in the Matrix type of thing, but I'm putting it with all this. So I was in my living room, and my cat got up and came over to me to convince me to get up because it was lunchtime. She likes eating and drinking while I make my lunch. So I got up and she raced ahead of me to the kitchen, as she usually does. I was right behind her. When I entered the kitchen, she wasn't there. This baffled me. So I checked the pantry and the bathroom, and she wasn't there either. I turned back around and called for her, because occasionally she'll come out when I do. As I walked into the living room, my cat came trotting out from my mom's room. Now, the kitchen and my mom's room are on completely opposite sides of the apartment, meaning she would have had to get by me to go from the kitchen to her room. I had been right behind her when she ran into the kitchen, and I didn't see her leave and run past me. There is absolutely no way I would not have seen her. I don't know how she got from one end of the building to the other, but it was very odd. Now, two things happened just a couple of days ago. The first thing was that one of my contacts went missing. I take out my contacts every night at the kitchen counter. Bathroom sink is too small with little to no counter space, because I don't want my contacts to fall into the sink or down the drain. I always very deliberately make sure my contacts are in the case before closing them up and putting them away. My left contact had gone missing a couple of times before, and while annoyed, I did assume I was misplacing it somehow, but having it twice before, I was now paranoid about it happening again, and made absolutely sure both contacts were in the solution before closing it up and putting them away. The next morning, the contact was gone. It wasn't stuck to the cap, it wasn't pressed against the sides of the case. I did eventually find it dried up under one of the things on the kitchen counter, which sure seems like I misplaced it, but there was no way this could have happened because it was very much in the case. I could see the slight blue tint of it in the solution before I put the cap on. This one may have some explanation, but I'm not able to find it myself, because I have no idea how it could have gotten out of the case in the middle of the night on its own. The second thing happened the next day. I was taking my morning shower, and my mom had left to go visit my grandma, as she usually does on the weekends. I was alone in the house aside from my cat. As I was washing up, I heard the front door open and close, and footsteps. After a moment, I heard my mom's voice, annoyed, and having what sounded like a conversation on the phone. I couldn't make out words, but it was definitely her voice. I was wondering if something had happened, but she wasn't trying to shout to me over the sound of the water, so I figured it wasn't anything too serious. But was confused as to her being back home so quickly, as she usually doesn't come back until around 2 or 3. This was 11 or 12-ish. Then I heard her say our cat's name, and so I thought she was scolding her for something, but I had no idea what for. There were pauses of silence here and there before the conversation would pick back up, and there'd be the occasional footsteps, sounding like she was walking around the kitchen and living room. And then eventually it stopped as I got out of the shower. I left the bathroom completely expecting to see my mom and ask her what was going on, but she wasn't there. The front door was still locked, and I hadn't heard her leave. I did hear one of the neighbors in this apartment building talking with her son outside, but she sounds nothing like my mom. Her voice is higher pitched than my mom's. Most of our neighbors are guys, with only one other woman, and she wasn't nearby, and she also doesn't sound like my mom. When my mom did actually come home, I asked her if she had come back at some point, and she hadn't. She doesn't know what happened either. So yeah, these are the weird experiences I've been having in this apartment. I don't know what to make of them. I have to assume that if these things are all paranormal, then there's multiple spirits or entities. Because while the blanket thing doesn't feel bad at all, the bouncy ball and the missing contact feel playful and mischievous. But the last thing with my mom's voice very much freaked me out. That could be because I've heard mimics and that they can be dangerous, as opposed to whatever actually being negative. But I don't know. I haven't really experienced much in the way of paranormal before, personally, even though I do believe. My mom, however, has always been sensitive to it. I know when she was a teen and my aunt, the one that lived with us, and some friends played with a Ouija board, and they experienced activity while doing so. And my mom had told me, after we moved out, that in the house we lived when I was between 3 and 8, she would hear a baby crying under the stairs at night. She knew it wasn't me, because she'd go check on me, I'd be asleep and fine, and as I grew older, the crying remained that of a baby. That same house right before we moved out. 4. This happened to me in 1994, so I've had a lot of time to resonate with what happened this night. I will preface the event by saying that prior to it I had a lot of angry emotions. Basically, I was mad at the world, which is something that entities seem to feed off of. I was breaking up with a girlfriend and moving out with a roommate under less than ideal circumstances, and needed to find a place to live quick. So I was sound asleep. I had gone to sleep early. My roommate and I were not talking, so I just hung in my room pretty much anyway until I was moving out, except to go to work. The way it started is I was awoken with a thud through my body. When I wake up, I am on the floor, not in the bed where I had been sleeping. On top of that, I was facing in the opposite direction that I had been sleeping on the floor. My head was now where my feet would be on the bed, but again, I was on the floor. As I awaken, I look up, and in front of the closed door to my room I see a black hooded figure floating in air, seemingly looking at me. I say seemingly because there's no face at all inside of the hood, just darkness. The whole mass of this black hooded figure was incredibly black, blacker than the night around it. I could literally feel evil on it, and the fear coming out of me was immense. I could not talk, but maybe this was out of fear. I am not saying I was paralyzed here, it all happened so incredibly quick, less than a minute. I'm not sure how it was gone. I forget that part. Probably a blink, but honestly, I just do not remember how that part happened. For years, I just put this event out of my mind. There was no internet then to ask questions to folks or even to look up what had happened to me. I even questioned in my mind if this really happened, but I know it did. I clearly remember hearing my roommate and his friends talking down the hall while this was going on. No one came, so I guess they did not hear me hit the ground. Speaking of that part, for years I just thought I was thrown onto the ground, but with more contemplation, I think I understood that to get into that position facing the opposite direction, I had to have been sleeping in, that I was most likely levitated off the bed in the air, turned around, then dropped on the ground, with that thud that woke me up. When I got married, I told my wife of this story. At first I think she thought I was nuts and did not believe it. She was the first person I told this story to, and that took 15 years. I have now told many folks, including my family. I find the more people you tell your story to, the more folks are likely to tell you a ghost story of their own that you would not have heard any other way. One night about 10 years ago, I'm trying to find some information on this encounter, and lo and behold, if you Google the term black hooded figure, well, it seems like this entity has made quite a few appearances. Suddenly, I do not feel so alone. And something else happened that night. With this information in front of her after I showed it to her, my wife now believed that this just might have happened after all. It was nice to have some validation to this story I stood by for years, in the words of other folks, and it was even better I had told my first story for years and then found theirs. I know this form of figure is referred to as death in some stories and in movies. I contend that these beings have always existed and that movies and books did not make them up. I feel that someone had an encounter and instead of telling it to the world, as no one would believe them, just started putting them in pop culture, and it was appropriated to this. I could be wrong, but that is what I feel. There was no death that night of anyone I knew, and no one died soon afterwards that would be signed to. I just really feel I had a lot of negative feelings flowing out of me, and it just stopped by to feed. I never saw a ghost in that house before, and I never encountered another in that house before I left. As a matter of fact, I have never encountered another ghost in my life. But this one really knew how to make an impression. You can believe this or not, but it happened. I have no proof, just my story and a memory. 5. Before I get to my story, I feel a bit of information is necessary. Growing up, I was what you would consider a cautious skeptic. This basically meant that I didn't believe in cryptids, the paranormal, unidentified flying objects. I know, I must have been one of those types that was real fun at parties. I always took a more rational approach toward these things, especially since I grew up. So many of them have been debunked in one shape or form. So here's where my story begins. I was going through the aftermath of a pretty messy divorce. Although my ex-wife had been caught committing adultery, her lawyer managed to be better than mine, and through some chicanery, she got half of everything and the entire house. The only silver lining was we had joint custody of my then 14-year-old daughter, Erica. I was lucky enough to have a job that allowed some wiggle room and various agencies throughout the country. After asking my boss if I could take an extended leave of absence in order to get my affairs in order, he was more than willing to do so. So I decided I would clear my head the only way I knew how: camping. I would take 2 weeks to myself so I could hike along and camp along the Appalachian Trail. Nature was always my coping mechanism, and nothing cleared my head more than the roar of a campfire and a morning bath in a mountain stream. And cope I did. If anything, sorrow gave way pretty quickly, and I began to feel like a new man. But as promised, I made sure to check in with family as much as possible. This usually consisted of me stopping by whatever establishment I came across, whether it be a ranger station or a campground with functioning phones. I did it as often as I possibly could, just so my family knew I was okay. It was during one of these phone calls where we have a bombshell dropped in my lap. I called my ex-wife knowing there was a chance my daughter would be home. And in the off chance my daughter or my ex didn't answer, they at least had an answering machine so I could leave a message. The answering machine picks up, and I begin recording by telling them where I am. I wouldn't say I was even 6 seconds into the recording when I hear the all-too-familiar static click of a phone being picked up as it interrupts the machine. "Hey, Daddy," answers Erica. "So where are you on the trail?" she asks me. But I sense this sadness in her voice. "Oh, sweetheart, if I had to guess, I'm still somewhere right around of West Virginia." "You sound upset. Are you okay?" There's a bit of hesitation to her voice, and she just bursts into tears on the end of her line. "No, Daddy, Mom and I got some really bad news from Aunt Lori. Great-Grandpa Jimmy passed away." The news hit me like a runaway truck, and before I knew it, I was slumping in a chair in the middle of the evening in this campground ranger station. "Hey, buddy, you okay?" The ranger I had come to know as Ted asked me. Before I could completely answer him back, my ex asked my daughter for the phone, and then politely asked her to leave the room. For the first time since we began divorce proceedings, she had a genuine tone of sincerity to her voice. "Eddie, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. I know you're trying to clear your head after everything, but your sister couldn't get in contact with you. She knew you would get in contact with one of us at some point because you've been pretty good about doing that. Listen, what I'm about to tell you is rough, so you need to sit down if you're not already doing it." "I am," was the only response I could muster up while choking back tears. "So that mailman that was friends with your grandfather asked for a wellness check when he realized it had been a few days since he came out to get the mail and say hello. When emergency services and the police found your grandpa, he was laying next to a 6-foot step ladder in his laundry room. They think he lost his footing and hit his head on the washing machine on the way down. If anything, they say he was more than likely knocked out cold and didn't feel anything. I'm so sorry." As soon as she finished what she told me, I let it all out, and she cried with me, telling me she wished she could do more. I didn't even say goodbye, I just hung up. The shock was intense, and it was hitting me like a tsunami. I looked up at Ted and asked him if he could take me to whatever Greyhound station was close by, so I got a bus ticket, and I headed to my sister's place. For the next few weeks, we were in the throes of grief while planning his funeral, and taking care of all the other heart-wrenching things that come with losing a loved one. My grandfather was one of those men who could be as intimidating as a raging grizzly bear and as gentle as a lamb the next. He served in the army, and after he was done, he dabbled in everything from carpentry to stonemasonry to electrical work. That man had a work ethic that was comparable to Jimmy Carter's, and he always told me so long as his hands worked, he would always find a way to put them to good use. So it made perfect sense for him to get into the house-flipping business after losing my grandmother in '97. This had been a fantastic source of supplemental income for him, especially since his military pension offered just barely enough for him to make ends meet. But he was smart enough to save a fairly decent nest egg, and he knew how to work real estate auctions, so they played out to his advantage. If memory serves correct, at the time he had 5 different houses he either sold after fixing up or kept as rental properties. He knew how to hire reliable property managers, and very rarely did he ever complain about his tenants. One of the last things we had to endure was the reading of his last will and testament. I wasn't expecting much, nor did I want anything. I just wanted my best friend back. You see, when I was an infant, my mother was way too young to be a parent. She was 15 when she had me, and just barely pushing 18 when she had my sister. She knew she wasn't cut out for motherhood at the time, and so she signed over custody to my grandparents in order to get her life straight. Eventually, she disappeared into the ether, and my grandparents did their best to make sure they raised 2 respectable adults. After my grandmother's passing, things became harder, but come hell or high water, my grandfather was determined to make her proud. He taught both my sister and I the importance of respecting ourselves and others. He taught me the value of an honest, hard day's work, and he taught me that no matter what I enjoyed in my downtime, so long as it wasn't illegal, it was okay in his book. Now that man was gone. My sister and I are sitting amongst family members, some of whom we hadn't seen since childhood, and everything sounded like a muddled, droning noise. I'd all but completely checked out almost an hour into the whole debacle. That is, until my sister's name was called. My grandfather willed to her his 2 remaining rental properties, thankfully both still within the state and less than a 2-hour drive away. He expressly said in his documentation that she could keep the houses and continue renting them out or sell them, whatever she saw fit. And then my name was called. At first, it was just some innocuous stuff, some fishing equipment he'd saved since I was a teenager, an old bicycle he and I restored. But it was the last thing that threw me for a loop. One of the things we talked about frequently was this Georgian-style house he managed to get for a steal at auction for only $29,000. He'd been putting quite a bit of work into the place over the past several years, and decided it was going to be a fixer-upper he would spend the rest of his life in. I was already pretty familiar with the things he had done: refinished the kitchen, fixed the plumbing, cleaned up and remodeled the bedrooms. He even ran new conduits and wiring through the house after realizing vandals and copper thieves had made their way inside at some point. This house was left to me. I'm certain he had no idea I was going to lose my home in the divorce, but the same caveat he gave to my sister applied to me as well. I was going to be allowed to either keep the house or sell it. But first I had to see it with my own 2 eyes. The first thing I had to do was make sure my job transfer would go through. This place was a half-day's drive away in Kentucky, and though it was far, it wasn't too far for me to still have weekend visits with my daughter if I hit the road early enough. And so once my boss gave me the green light and thanked me for being a valued employee under his watch, I rented a moving van and purchased a less than reliable TomTom GPS. This was back in the day when cell phones weren't necessarily as normalized and important as they are now. I didn't have one, didn't really see the need for one. Of course, they didn't do as much back then. Turns out I was wrong. You see, during road trips, my grandfather never got lost. He took the scenic route. In my case, I was utterly, hopelessly lost. The GPS system was nowhere near as advanced as they would later become. They weren't as timely in announcing detours and road closures as something along the lines of Google Maps would be today. It was at least 2 hours away when I encountered an area of the highway that had been washed away during a recent violent rainstorm due to a nearby stream flooding over. The detour I was sent on took me in the opposite direction I was driving for the better part of 20 to 30 minutes. I finally sucked it up and stopped off at a gas station in order to get directions. Thankfully, they were quite accurate, and at least they got me into the town where I was supposed to go. Shortly after arriving, I pulled into a parking lot at a nearby establishment that used to be a bookstore. The woman inside was as friendly as ever, but when I asked her for directions to the old baker place, she got a look on her face like somebody had been tap dancing on her tombstone. "Oh, honey love, why, pray tell, would you ever want to go there?" she asked with the voice of a concerned southern belle. I explained that my grandfather had been living there for some time while fixing the place up, and he had recently passed. She had placed a hand on my shoulder and sweetly offered her condolences. She gave me directions, which I went ahead and wrote down, but as I went to leave the shop, she spoke up and said something that made me roll my eyes a bit. "I think you should know that place is seriously haunted. It's got a reputation." I respectfully thanked her for the directions and held my tongue, but once again, staunch non-believer. Upon finally reaching my destination and pulling into the driveway, I fully understood why my grandfather opted to make this his forever home. This beautiful 2-story brick home sat on an amazing piece of land. He had neighbors, but they were so far away you could barely make out the rooftops through the tree line. There was a nicely sized pond at the edge of his backyard with a dock I could only guess he'd built in order for him to sit out and fish when he needed to relax. The elm trees that dotted the backyard provided some shade, and he opted to put a hammock up between the two of them. The yard was well maintained and gave off the most welcoming atmosphere as sunbeams peeked through the tree branches. I was sufficiently satisfied with what I'd seen outside, and it was time to check the inside of the house. Upon entering, I could see the massive amount of work my grandfather put into the place. Beautifully finished wood floors stretched from room to room. The only expectations being the slate tiles he had put down in the kitchen and the linoleum-floored mudroom to the left of the main entrance. I took a walk upstairs and inspected each of the 4 bedrooms. He had masterfully installed Berber carpet in each, and yet only 2 were furnished, one of which appeared to be a kind of office and guest sleeping area. I made my way to the bathroom at the end of the hall and did my business. It had been a long drive, and by this point I really needed to. After I was done, I made the decision to check out the only room in the house I hadn't, the laundry room. I did a bit of poking around until I came to the hallway downstairs. It wasn't as long as the one upstairs, but it was certainly dark. I only saw 2 rooms and what appeared to be a linen closet. The first door I opened led to a half-bathroom with a toilet and a sink. As I suspected, the room directly across from it was nothing more than a storage area for sheets and towels. So I walked to the end of the hallway, feeling my heart sink more with each step. I opened the door to the laundry room, and a wave of emotion hit me. For those who aren't in the know, much like me at the time, crime scene cleanup isn't really a thing unless it's contracted by the family or police. I would later find this out myself, but at this time, I was fighting back the urge to scream. Sitting in front of me just feet away from the room's entrance was that 6-foot ladder still standing in place, and a large pool of now coagulated blood in front of and under the washing machine. I walked out of the house and sat behind the steering wheel of the moving van while trying to collect myself. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I came to the realization that if it's going to get cleaned up, I would have to be the one to do it. Sundown was approaching quickly, and I knew I had to get whatever supplies I needed in order to get this grisly task out of the way. I made it to a local general store with precious few minutes to spare, and made my way inside in order to get whatever cleaning supplies and PPE I could get my hands on. I said nothing to the person working behind the counter, but by the look they gave me, I must have been a sight. I arrived at what was once my grandfather's house, now mine. I paused for a moment before taking a deep breath and grabbing the supplies I needed to get this mess out of the way. Upon entering the room, the severity of the mess became all that more apparent. I'll try not to get into too much detail with this part, but let's just say that blood wasn't the only thing I was cleaning up, and that my grandfather had definitely been laying there for at least a few days before being found. The next time you get the sudden urge to complain about cleaning out a cat box, keep this in mind: there are far worse things to clean up on your own. I was at it for a while. Didn't necessarily time it, but I know by the time I was done, the smell of ammonia in that room was so palpable I was lightheaded. I cracked open the small window in the back of the room in order to let out some of the fumes. By this point it was nightfall. After all that cleaning, it occurred to me that I was way too tired to bring in everything and set up my bed. Screw it, I'll just do it in the morning, I said to myself, as I walked out to the van in order to grab a pillow and my sleeping bag at the very least. I decided to sleep on the tweed sectional couch, sitting directly in the center of the living room. As I laid in the nice piece of furniture, I realized just how comfortable it was. Before I knew it, I'd completely drifted off, after shutting off the light. In the middle of the night, I started stirring. I was in that mode where somewhere between sleep and awake. Eyes completely shut, body completely limp, but you can hear everything going on around you. I'm hearing this scratching noise, and at first I'm thinking I'm an idiot because I didn't shut that window before going to sleep and maybe a bat got in. I started stirring, and eventually I come to on the couch. I'm still bone-tired and laying there, but I'm more than awake when I have this realization that the scratching noise is coming from everywhere but above me. As the noise eventually starts coming from under the couch, I start wondering if maybe my grandfather had a problem with mice or even possibly squirrels. Paranormal wasn't even on the radar. I finally mustered up enough energy to sit up and walk over to the light switch, having not completely ruled out the possibility of a bat. When I flip on the switch, the scratching noise stops abruptly. I sat and waited to see if it came back for a while, and sleep ended up winning out once more. I sat back down on the couch. I don't know what time I woke up in the morning, but I was stiff as could be, because I ended up falling asleep sitting up. After going to the moving van and grabbing a couple of boxes marked kitchen, I found my coffee maker and set out to make a pot to help me fuel up for the day. I grabbed a gym bag full of clean clothing and a couple of towels from the linen closet and made my way upstairs to take a shower. As I'm lathering up, I hear the distinct sound of somebody talking just outside the door. I can't really make out what they're saying, but I can tell by the cadence and tone it's a male voice. I stuck my head out from behind the curtain in order to get a better listen, but it just sounded muffled. There was a window overlooking the front yard and the road going by. I figured there was a chance maybe one of the neighbors was driving by listening to the radio at a loud volume. I'm rinsing off the Irish Spring and doing my best to rationalize what just happened. I felt satisfied with my own explanation, and after I got dressed, I began the arduous task of bringing in all of my crap. I set boxes in their respective rooms and eventually grabbed my beat-up yet still working AM/FM radio from a box in the kitchen and made my way up to the bedroom I decided I would make my own in order to put my bed together. I'm sitting there listening to the only alternative rock station I could find in the area. I've never been one for country music nor one for gospel stations, so as I'm listening to what I would like to say was The Offspring, my radio starts going haywire. It starts sporadically skipping from station to station as if this seek feature some of these radios had decided to finally go up. I'm getting ready to unplug the radio out of frustration when I realized it almost sounded as if it was forming statements and sentences. Out of sheer morbid curiosity, I stop and listen. "Are you listening?" Seemingly, as it stops on a few random stations, forming the question. "Okay," I say to myself with a slightly confused tone. "Sorry she heard you," it says. It stopped on a news station, followed up by some random R&B song. What's going on? I asked out loud as if I expected somebody to answer me back. "He sees you," the radio said as it stopped on a radio sermon. I was dumbfounded. I had no clue what was going on. If anything, this almost felt like one of those EVP sessions I'd seen time and again when my ex-wife watched those godforsaken ghost hunter shows. I'd always found myself looking for strings, the shadow of somebody manipulating a station, to make it seem as if it were paranormal, or even the odd piece of tape on the aforementioned seek button on their little handheld radios. I remember an episode where my feelings were all but validated when Grant and Jason caught the person they're doing an investigation for engaging in a bit of manipulation of their own. I always thought it was a load of bull, and yet here we are. I don't know why, but I jokingly made an off-the-cuff comment in an almost mocking tone. "He sees me. What? Does he read Stutter Kane?" The radio, still flipping through channels, stopped on either a talk show or a radio DJ making a comment along the lines of, "That's pretty funny." Now I thought I was losing it. I'm reaching for the plug, and I'm absolutely through with entertaining this idea, but as I have my thumb and forefinger on the wire, and I'm getting ready to pull it from the outlet, the radio chimes in with the word basement. I pause for a moment because I realize that's the one part of the house I hadn't checked yet. The radio is still continuously scanning, and it throws a sequence of numbers at me. 7, 2, 7, 1. And just like that, it stops back on the alternative rock station I was listening to, as if nothing happened at all. I look back at it while Spoonman by Soundgarden pumps from the speakers. Fair enough. Guess I'll take the hint, I say to myself, as I decide to put off the finishing touches on my bed until I make my way downstairs. I fish around through a couple of boxes and eventually come across a battery-powered lantern I took with me on camping trips. The batteries were still good as it powered on, no problem, and I took myself into the basement in order to give it a look. As I'm walking around the dark room, giving it a look over, I start noticing a few more things that need attention. There were parts of the foundation that needed to be repaired, signs of obvious water damage in a few spots, thankfully not too bad. Some of the wires under the floorboards were wearing down and would more than likely need to be replaced by a licensed electrician in the near future. Nothing that would have warranted voices from the afterlife telling me to check the place out. I was getting ready to head back upstairs when I noticed a small shelf with some paint cans under the steps. In between the paint cans is a small lockbox with a digital display and keypad. I remembered the numbers the radio spat at me. Just for the hell of it, I go over to the little lockbox. It was about the right size for a small handgun, and I wouldn't have been surprised if I punched in the code and found one sitting in that box. So after I press a button, and its digital display lights up, I press 7271. And watch as the little red display light turns green before the box emits a small popping noise, indicating the lock had opened. Again, I'm fully expecting a small revolver or 9mm pistol in this box. Instead, I find an envelope. It's aged, coffee-stained, and I could tell it was overstuffed with something. I almost didn't think too much of it until I realized my name was written in fading blue pen on the front. I took the envelope upstairs and sat at the kitchen table while starting to review its contents. There must have been a dozen letters neatly folded and stuffed into this envelope, and as I read through them, I realized they were all correspondence letters between my grandparents and my mother. Some went back as far as 1994, and the most recent was dated 4 months from the date of my grandfather's passing. These letters detailed one hell of a story. They spoke of addiction, the unreadiness to be a parent, abusive relationships, and regret she experienced by making the decision to not be in the lives of my sister and I. But as I started reading further, the letters started to become less depressing and more uplifting. They went from a young mother wallowing in poor decisions to an older and wiser woman, ready to make peace with her past and finally re-enter the lives of her children. She honestly admitted she would have ruined in her younger years. She expressed fear that we would reject her in the second-to-last letter, but also confirmed in the last letter that she wanted to make plans during this year's upcoming Thanksgiving or Christmas in order to surprise us. I don't know how I felt about all this. It was almost too coincidental. Was there a chance my grandfather led me to this massive discovery? After all, my ex-wife was always saying ghosts usually stuck around due to unfinished business. I always thought she was just ripping off that line from Casper. But I sat at a table full of letters at a woman I thought had just moved on, and I had no idea that even existed. There was a point during a conversation where my grandfather had said he needed to tell me something, but he preferred to do so in person. But this was during the whole messy divorce process, and he passed before he had the chance to do so. So was this his unfinished business? I don't know, but I will say this much. On that day I was a little less skeptical. I would find myself overcome by emotion again. After a good crying session at that table, I collected myself and called my sister. I told her what I had found in the basement, but I didn't tell her what led me there. I don't know if my sister really knew how to process it herself, judging by her tone of voice, but we eventually made the decision to get in contact with our mother to, at the very least, let her know about her father's passing. After that day, I didn't experience anything else. Well, anything out of the norm. I half-jokingly told myself that if there were any more spirits in this house, maybe they liked me enough to let me do my thing in peace. We eventually got in contact with my mom and had a reunion of sorts. Understandably, the relationship was on shaky ground at best, but she proved to us that she really did need to get her life straight. And through a much thorough series of conversations, we too came to realize that she wasn't what most people would have considered an ideal parent at the time. Our somewhat strained relationship improved over time, and now she's a pretty regular fixture in the lives of my sister and I. I stayed in that house for a little over 5 years and did little repairs here and there, but eventually I realized it was too much house for me and wanted something a bit more modest. At this point, my daughter was in college, and she had moved clear across the country, and my sister understood when I told her I wanted to move somewhere like Maine or Vermont. So eventually I sold the house for a reasonable sum, and I settled down in a nice 2-bedroom, 1.5-bathroom rancher-style home in a nice small town in Maine, and I barely looked back. So as I sit here today and I write this out, I will say that I'm no longer 100% skeptical. If anything, I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic these days. After all, part of me would like to believe my grandfather did in fact finish his business by leading me to my mother. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I've had plenty of private conversations between he and I, where I have thanked him for doing this and told him how much I miss him. Grief never completely dissipates. If anything, you just learn to work through it a little better each day. But Grandpa Jim, I can only do right by you by living how you taught me to live, treating people with the same amount of respect they show me and others, and passing along all those very important life lessons you taught me at such a young age. I love you, old man. I just hope you're in a better place with Grandma, and I'm making you proud. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to Paranormal Stories, episode 394. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories and sent in stories for use in this video. You can send your own stories along to kingofthecities@gmail.com. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that by joining my Patreon linked in the description, and we also have channel memberships available if that is of interest to you too. And before we go, we have a little shout out to give to the author of the first story, Lola Paranormal, which is also their handle on TikTok. Okay, no other business today, so let's move along to Hellfreezer's question of the day. And today's question is: what is the weirdest email, if you're willing to share, that you have recently got? I woke up today from an email from Amazon that seems to be legitimate, telling me that my Vitamix blender, which I have had for 6 years and works fine, has been recalled because it's faulty after 6 years of working fine. So I'm going to dig into it, see if it's actually worth my while sending it back or getting the replacement kit. But the particular model is the Vitamix Ascent 2500, but mine's a slightly different. Mine's a variation of that model. So we'll see. I mean, I guess it's good that they're paying enough attention, but I was genuinely confused. I mean, if there was a problem, wouldn't it have presented before 6 years? Anyway, that's mine. Let me know what you think in a comment below. And before we go, let's take a look at the answer of the day from a previous video. And this question came from Paranormal Stories 392, and it was: do you prefer Jason or Michael in terms of your horror movie villains? And today's answer comes from Enza Sierra. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that only Jason has been to space. Checkmate. That is true, but rumor has it they once approached John Carpenter about doing another Halloween film, and his idea was put Michael in space. Maybe all the slasher characters, like Jason, Michael, the Leprechaun character, there was a space film for that. Freddy Krueger, maybe they all come from an alien planet called Stabulon or something. I shouldn't say that too loudly, someone will make that movie. Thank you very much for your answer, Enza. And before I go, there is a new channel, not a Hellfreezer channel, but a new me channel. That's under my name, John Wilkie, the John Wilkie. And that's where I'll be putting This Week in Hell and other non-Reddit related readings from now on, unless it's something I really feel would fit with this channel, but we'll see. And I'll link that for you in the description. And with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourself.